At the close of the 19th century, the United States stood at a turning point, a nation that had long thought of itself as a republic apart from the rival empires of Europe, yet increasingly drawn toward the wider world by trade, technology, and a restless sense of destiny. For more than a century, Americans had expanded across a continent, displacing native peoples, fighting Mexico, and stitching together a transcontinental state. But overseas empire, the kind marked by colonies across oceans, still seemed to belong to others, to Britain, France, and Spain. The conflict that would change that perception began not in Washington, but in the decaying remnants of one of those old empires, in the Caribbean island of Cuba, where rebellion, repression, and sensational journalism combined to pull the United States into war with Spain in 1898. Cuba had been a Spanish colony for nearly 4 centuries, and by the late 1800s Spanish rule there was both resented and fragile. Sugar plantations dominated the economy, much of the land owned by Spanish-born elites or foreign investors, including many Americans. Earlier uprisings against Spanish authority had failed, but they had left a tradition of resistance and a generation of exiles who continued to agitate for independence. In 1895, a new revolt erupted, led in part by intellectuals and nationalists who believed Cuba deserved to be a sovereign republic. Among the most important voices was José Martí, a poet, journalist, and revolutionary who had spent years in exile in the United States, studying its politics while warning against both Spanish tyranny and the danger of falling under U.S. control. Martí was killed early in the uprising, becoming a martyr, but the rebellion he helped inspire spread across the countryside. Spain responded with harsh counterinsurgency tactics. The Spanish commander, Valeriano Weyler, instituted a policy known as reconcentration. Rural Cubans were forced from their homes into guarded towns and camps, supposedly to separate civilians from guerrilla fighters. In reality, these camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and disease-ridden. Tens of thousands died from hunger and illness. News of this suffering reached the United States through letters, travelers' accounts, and most powerfully through the booming mass circulation newspapers of the era. The 1890s were the golden age of what critics called yellow journalism, a style of reporting that prized sensation, drama, and moral outrage. Newspaper magnates like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer competed fiercely for readers in New York and beyond. Their papers ran graphic stories about Spanish atrocities in Cuba, often exaggerating or embellishing the facts, but tapping into genuine sympathy for Cuban rebels and a broader American belief that their nation had a special mission to advance liberty. Illustrations of starving families and brutal soldiers filled the pages. Headlines thundered about barbarism just 90 miles from Florida's shores. These stories did not create American interest in Cuba from nothing. The island was economically important to the United States, which bought large quantities of Cuban sugar and had invested millions of dollars there. Instability threatened those interests. At the same time, a generation of American thinkers and politicians had begun to argue that the country needed to look outward. Influenced by naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, they believed great powers required strong navies, overseas bases, and access to global markets. Industrial growth had created surpluses of goods and capital. Some feared that without new markets, the economy would falter. Others spoke in terms of national vigor, warning that a nation that stopped expanding would decline. Yet the United States was not united in these views. Many Americans still cherished an anti-imperial tradition rooted in the nation's own struggle against colonial rule. They worried that ruling foreign peoples without their consent would betray Republican principles. For the moment, however, events in Cuba were moving faster than abstract debate. In early 1898, tensions rose sharply. The U.S. battleship USS Maine, technically not a sports team, but categorized here as an organization-like entity, sailed into Havana Harbor on a friendly visit, officially to protect American lives and property, but also as a show of force. On the night of February 15, a massive explosion ripped through the ship, killing more than 250 sailors. The cause was unclear. Later investigations would suggest an internal accident, possibly involving coal bunkers and ammunition. But in the fevered atmosphere of the time, many Americans were quick to blame Spain. Newspapers seized on the disaster. "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry, often paired with "To hell with Spain." The sinking turned a distant colonial struggle into a personal affront, a blow against American honor. President William McKinley had been cautious, preferring diplomacy and hoping to avoid war. He pressed Spain to grant Cuba greater autonomy and end reconcentration. Spain made some concessions, replacing Whaler and offering reforms, but it refused to promise full independence. As public anger mounted and Congress debated, McKinley concluded that intervention was inevitable. In April 1898, Congress passed a resolution recognizing Cuban independence and authorizing the president to use force to compel Spain's withdrawal. Attached to this resolution was the Teller Amendment, which declared that the United States did not intend to annex Cuba. This was a crucial promise, meant to reassure those who feared imperial conquest and to signal that the war's stated purpose was liberation, not acquisition. Spain, seeing this as interference in its sovereignty, declared war. The United States followed, and a brief but far-reaching conflict began. Although Cuba was the emotional heart of the crisis, the war quickly expanded across the globe, revealing how far American ambitions and Spanish vulnerabilities stretched. The first major clash took place not in the Caribbean, but in the Pacific. Commodore George Dewey commanded the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, stationed in Hong Kong. When war came, he was ordered to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, another Spanish colony simmering with its own independence movement. On May 1, 1898, Dewey's ships steamed into Manila Bay and engaged the Spanish squadron. The battle was astonishingly one-sided. Superior training, gunnery, and technology allowed the Americans to destroy or disable the Spanish fleet with minimal losses of their own. The victory electrified the United States. Overnight, Americans who had barely thought about the Philippines found themselves confronting the reality that their navy now controlled a major harbor in Asia. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, anti-Spanish forces led by Emilio Aguinaldo saw an opportunity. Aguinaldo had previously fought the Spanish and had been living in exile. He returned with American assistance and rallied Filipino troops, hoping that U.S. intervention would lead to Philippine independence, just as Cubans hoped for theirs. For the moment, American and Filipino goals seemed aligned, but the future would reveal deep tensions. Back in the Caribbean, the United States prepared to invade Cuba itself. The army was small and not fully prepared for overseas war. Many units were composed of volunteers, fired by patriotism but lacking experience. Among them was the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders, a unit that included cowboys, college athletes, and adventurers, and was led in part by the energetic and publicity-savvy Theodore Roosevelt, who had resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to seek glory in the field. American forces landed near Santiago de Cuba in June 1898. The campaign that followed was marked by confusion, heat, disease, and logistical problems. Tropical conditions proved as deadly as Spanish bullets. Still, U.S. troops, alongside Cuban insurgents, advanced toward the city. The most famous fighting occurred at San Juan Heights, where American soldiers assaulted well-defended Spanish positions. The charge up what came to be known as San Juan Hill, though in reality involving several hills and units, became legendary, especially in stories that highlighted Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, sometimes overshadowing the contributions of regular army units and African-American regiments, whose courage was widely praised at the time but later minimized in popular memory. naval power again proved decisive. The Spanish fleet in Santiago harbor attempted to escape, but was intercepted and destroyed by the U.S. Navy. With its ships gone and land forces surrounded, Santiago surrendered. Soon after, Spain sought terms. Fighting also occurred in Puerto Rico, another Spanish colony in the Caribbean, where U.S. forces met relatively light resistance before the war's end. The war had lasted only a few months, but its consequences were immense. In December 1898, representatives of the United States and Spain met in Paris to negotiate a peace treaty. The resulting agreement, the Treaty of Paris, reshaped the map. Spain relinquished its claim to Cuba, which was to become independent under U.S. military occupation. It also ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. Most controversially, Spain transferred sovereignty over the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. With these acquisitions, the United States suddenly possessed territories thousands of miles from its shores, inhabited by millions of people who were not granted full constitutional rights. The war that had been justified as a crusade for Cuban freedom had resulted in an American overseas empire. Supporters argued this was a natural and beneficial step, bringing order, development, and eventually self-government. Critics saw betrayal and warned of endless entanglements and moral compromise. The debate over what kind of nation the United States would be had only begun, and it would soon grow even more intense as events in the Philippines took a violent and unexpected turn, revealing that the end of one war could mark the beginning of another. Even before the ink on the peace treaty was dry, the uneasy partnership between American forces and Filipino revolutionaries was unraveling. Filipino leaders had proclaimed independence in June 1898, establishing a republic with Emilio Aguinaldo as its president. They had fought Spanish authority for years and had expected that the defeat of Spain would open the door to genuine sovereignty. Instead, they learned that the Philippines had been transferred from one imperial power to another, their future decided in European conference rooms where they had no voice. American officials were divided about what to do with the islands. Some argued for immediate independence, others for a limited protectorate, and still others for full colonial control. Strategic concerns weighed heavily. The Philippines offered a gateway to Asian markets, coaling stations for the Navy, and a symbol of great power status. Economic motives mingled with racial and cultural assumptions. Many Americans believed Filipinos were not yet ready for self-government, an attitude rooted in a mix of paternalism and prejudice that mirrored justifications used by European empires. Tensions in Manila mounted through late 1898 and early 1899 as American troops occupied the city and Filipino forces controlled surrounding areas. On the night of February 4, 1899, a shot rang out between American sentries and Filipino soldiers. Skirmishing quickly escalated into full-scale conflict. The Philippine-American War had begun, though in the United States it was often described as an insurrection rather than a war, a choice of words that suggested illegitimacy on the part of the Filipino Republic. At first, Filipino forces attempted conventional warfare, forming armies and defending territory. They were outmatched. American troops had better weapons, training, and naval support. Major battles ended in U.S. victories, and by late 1899, Filipino leaders shifted to guerrilla tactics, dispersing into smaller units that relied on local support, surprise attacks, and knowledge of the terrain. The conflict became brutal and protracted. American soldiers, frustrated by an elusive enemy, adopted harsh counterinsurgency measures. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned. Civilians were relocated into protected zones, echoing the reconcentration policies that Americans had condemned in Cuba. Torture, including the notorious water cure, was used in interrogations. Disease and displacement took a heavy toll on the civilian population. Estimates of Filipino deaths vary widely, but they run into the hundreds of thousands, many from famine and illness exacerbated by the war. News of these practices filtered back to the United States, where they fueled a fierce political and moral debate. The Anti-Imperialist League, which included prominent figures such as writers, businessmen, and reformers, argued that ruling the Philippines violated the Declaration of Independence's principles. They warned that empire would corrupt American democracy, entangle the nation in foreign conflicts, and require repression abroad that would echo at home. Supporters of empire countered that the United States had a duty to bring order, education, and progress, and that withdrawal would lead to chaos or domination by another power. The conflict in the Philippines also influenced American military and administrative practices. The U.S. established a colonial government, gradually replacing military rule with civilian administration. Schools were built, infrastructure improved, and a new political system introduced, though ultimate authority remained in American hands. English became a language of instruction and governance. These reforms were presented as evidence of benevolent intentions, yet they existed alongside ongoing resistance and the reality that Filipinos had not chosen this arrangement. The war officially wound down after the capture of Aguinaldo in 1901, an event achieved through a daring ruse by American forces who infiltrated his camp. Aguinaldo swore allegiance to the United States, and organized resistance declined, though sporadic fighting continued for years, especially in the southern islands where Muslim communities resisted both Spanish and American control. While the Philippines consumed attention, the United States was also redefining its relationship with Cuba. Although the Teller Amendment had disavowed annexation, American troops occupied the island after Spain's departure. U.S. officials supervised the establishment of a new Cuban government, reorganized finances, improved sanitation, and sought to stabilize the economy. At the same time, they insisted on conditions for withdrawal. The Platt Amendment, attached to an Army Appropriations Bill in 1901, granted the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve order and required Cuba to lease naval bases to the U.S., most famously at Guantanamo Bay. Cuban leaders accepted these terms under pressure, and while the island formally became independent in 1902, its sovereignty was limited. Puerto Rico followed a different path. Ceded outright to the United States, it was governed under the Four-Acre Act and later legislation that established a civil government but left ultimate authority with Congress. Residents were eventually granted U.S. citizenship, yet they did not receive full political representation. Guam, strategically located in the Pacific, became a naval station. In each case, the United States experimented with new forms of rule that did not fit neatly into earlier categories of states or territories destined for statehood. The Spanish-American War and its aftermath thus marked a shift in how Americans understood their nation's role in the world. The frontier within North America, declared closed by the census of 1890, had long been seen as a source of opportunity and renewal. Now attention turned outward. Politicians spoke more openly of world power, sea lanes, and spheres of influence. The Navy expanded. Diplomacy became more assertive. This transformation was closely associated with the rising figure of Theodore Roosevelt. His wartime fame helped propel him into national office, first as vice president, and then, after McKinley's assassination in 1901, as president. Roosevelt embraced an energetic foreign policy, often summarized by his phrase about speaking softly and carrying a big stick. He believed the United States had not only the right, but the responsibility to act as a stabilizing force in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. Under Roosevelt, the U.S. supported the independence of Panama from Colombia in 1903, enabling the construction of the Panama Canal, a project that would dramatically enhance American naval mobility and commercial power. This episode, like the War of 1898, illustrated how strategic interests, economic motives, and a sense of civilizational mission could converge in actions that reshaped other nations' destinies. At home, the experience of empire also affected American society. Veterans returned with stories of distant lands. Popular culture absorbed images of tropical battlefields and exotic territories. Immigration debates, racial attitudes, and ideas about citizenship were influenced by the question of how non-white peoples within the new empire should be treated. Supreme Court decisions, known as the Insular Cases, addressed whether constitutional rights fully applied in overseas territories, concluding that some rights were fundamental while others did not automatically extend. A doctrine that created a category of unincorporated territories. The war with Spain, brief as it was, had opened a long chapter in which the United States would wrestle with the contradictions of being both a republic founded on anti-colonial revolution and a global power exercising control over distant peoples. The language of freedom and the practice of power would often exist in uneasy tension. Understanding this moment requires seeing not only the battles and treaties, but the ideas, fears, hopes, and prejudices that drove decisions, and the voices, both American and foreign, that struggled to define what the new century would bring for many Americans at the turn of the 20th century. The shift from continental expansion to overseas empire did not feel like a sharp break, but rather like the next step in a long national story. The United States had always grown, often through conflict, often justified by lofty language about liberty and progress. What changed in 1898 was the distance across which that power now reached and the nature of the peoples who came under American authority. No longer were new lands seen as future states to be settled in large numbers by Americans of European descent. Instead, they were densely populated societies with their own histories, cultures, and political aspirations. Governing them forced Americans to confront questions that had previously remained abstract. Political debate over empire cut across party lines and social classes. Some business leaders welcomed new markets and investment opportunities, seeing in Asia and the Caribbean vast potential for trade. Missionary organizations, already active overseas, spoke of a moral duty to spread Christianity and Western education. Military officers argued that global responsibilities required a modern, professional force and a network of bases. On the other side stood labor leaders who feared competition from colonial labor, reformers who saw imperialism as a distraction from domestic social problems, and intellectuals who warned that ruling subject peoples would erode democratic habits. The presidential election of 1900 became, in part, a referendum on these issues. William McKinley, running for re-election, defended the administration's record, portraying American rule in the Philippines as temporary stewardship leading towards self-government. His opponent, William Jennings Bryan, though known for his earlier focus on monetary reform, made anti-imperialism a central theme, arguing that the nation must not abandon its founding principles. McKinley's victory suggested that, at least for the moment, a majority of voters accepted or tolerated the new direction. The experience of war also accelerated changes in the American military. The difficulties of mobilizing volunteers, supplying troops in tropical climates, and coordinating land and naval operations highlighted the need for reform. Lessons learned in Cuba and the Philippines influenced the creation of a more professional general staff, improved medical services, and expanded officer training. The Navy, whose successes had been so visible, enjoyed strong public and congressional support. New battleships were authorized, and the idea that sea power underpinned national strength became widely accepted. The conflict also had profound implications for race relations and ideas about civilization. In Cuba and the Philippines, American soldiers and administrators encountered peoples they often viewed through a hierarchy that placed Anglo-Saxon culture at the top. Such attitudes were not new, but empire gave them global scope. Justifications for colonial rule frequently invoked the language of uplift, guardianship, and tutelage, suggesting that subject populations would eventually be prepared for self-rule under American guidance. Critics pointed out the hypocrisy of preaching liberty abroad while segregation and disenfranchisement spread at home, particularly in the South, where African Americans faced escalating violence and legal discrimination. African American soldiers played a significant role in the war, serving in segregated units that earned respect for their performance in battle. Yet they returned to a society that often denied them basic rights. Some black leaders saw the contradiction clearly, arguing that a nation unwilling to ensure justice for its own citizens had little moral authority to govern others. Newspapers and speeches from the period reveal a complex conversation within African American communities about service, patriotism, and protest. The legal status of the new territories forced the Supreme Court into unfamiliar territory. In a series of decisions beginning in 1901, the justices considered whether the Constitution followed the flag automatically. The insular cases concluded that full constitutional protections did not necessarily apply in all territories under American control. Instead, Congress had broad discretion in governing places deemed not destined for statehood. This doctrine allowed the United States to maintain an empire without formally admitting its inhabitants into the political community on equal terms. It also established precedents that would shape territorial governance for generations. In Cuba, formal independence did not end American influence. U.S. officials and investors remained deeply involved in the island's economy, especially in sugar production. Political instability and financial pressures led to repeated American interventions under the terms of the Platt Amendment. While many Cubans appreciated certain reforms introduced during occupation, others resented what they saw as a thinly veiled protectorate. Nationalist movements continued to press for fuller sovereignty, and the memory of 1898 was interpreted in different ways, as liberation by some, as substitution of one dominant power for another by others. In the Philippines, American administrators promoted education, public health, and infrastructure, often with genuine commitment. A public school system expanded rapidly and new roads and ports were built. At the same time, political power remained constrained. Filipinos participated in local and later national institutions, but ultimate authority rested with American governors and ultimately with Congress in Washington. Over time, U.S. policy shifted toward a gradual promise of independence, culminating decades later, but the early years were shaped by the legacy of war and distrust. The Spanish-American War also influenced how Americans viewed their place in global politics. Participation in the balance of power struggles of Europe had long been avoided, in line with earlier warnings against entangling alliances. Now, with territories in the Caribbean and Pacific, the United States could not remain aloof. Diplomacy with Asian powers, management of Caribbean debts, and concerns about rival empires all demanded attention. The nation began to speak the language of spheres of influence and international law, joining conferences and mediations that would have seemed remote to earlier generations. Culturally, the war fed a growing sense of national confidence. The swift defeat of an old European empire suggested that the United States had come of age as a world power. Parades, monuments, and veterans organizations kept the memory of the conflict alive. Popular magazines and schoolbooks often presented the war as a noble enterprise, downplaying its controversies. At the same time, dissenting voices persisted, reminding audiences of the human costs and moral dilemmas. Looking back, the events of 1898 and their aftermath can be seen as a hinge between eras. The United States that emerged was more outward-looking, more militarily prepared, and more deeply entangled in the affairs of distant regions. The questions raised then about intervention, self-determination, economic interest, and moral responsibility would recur throughout the 20th century and beyond. The Spanish-American War did not create these dilemmas from nothing, but it brought them into sharp focus, forcing Americans to define, in practice as well as in rhetoric, what their republic would mean in a world of empires as the United States adjusted to its new status. The memory of the Spanish-American War became more than a record of battles and treaties. It turned into a story Americans told themselves about who they were and what they believed their nation represented. Schoolchildren learned about the liberation of Cuba, the heroism at San Juan Heights, and the daring of naval commanders in distant seas. Less often did they hear in equal detail about reconcentration camps in the Philippines, the arguments of anti-imperialists, or the doubts expressed by those who feared that the Republic was drifting toward the habits of empire it had once denounced. The language of humanitarian intervention, so prominent in the run-up to war, did not disappear. On the contrary, it became a recurring feature of American foreign policy. The idea that the United States might use force not only for direct defense, but also to relieve suffering, prevent instability, or promote certain political outcomes, found one of its earliest large-scale expressions in Cuba. Yet the Cuban example also revealed how easily humanitarian goals could intertwine with strategic and economic interests. Sugar, trade routes, naval bases, and regional influence were never far from the calculations of policymakers, even when moral arguments dominated public speeches. The Caribbean, sometimes described by American leaders as a special sphere of responsibility, saw repeated interventions in the years after 1898. Financial crises, revolutions, and fears of European involvement provided justifications. The precedent that the United States could step in to stabilize governments, supervise customs houses, or reshape political systems rested in part on the confidence gained during the war with Spain. Each intervention was presented as temporary and necessary, yet together they established a pattern of influence that many Latin Americans regarded with suspicion and resentment. In Asia, possession of the Philippines required sustained engagement with a region previously distant from most American concerns. Trade with China, relations with Japan, and the defense of Pacific sea lanes took on new urgency. American policymakers articulated the open-door policy, seeking equal commercial access to China and opposing formal partition by European powers. Though framed in terms of fairness and territorial integrity, the policy also reflected the desire to secure markets without assuming the burdens of direct colonial rule over vast territories. At the same time, the experience of governing overseas territories forced Americans to grapple with the practicalities of empire. Colonial administrators had to learn languages, study local customs, and navigate complex social structures. Some approached these tasks with curiosity and respect, others with rigid assumptions. Policies on land ownership, taxation, and education could have far-reaching consequences, shaping class relations and political movements in ways not always foreseen. The gap between intentions and outcomes was often wide. The domestic political system adapted as well. Congressional committees took on new responsibilities related to insular affairs. Debates over tariffs, citizenship, and military spending increasingly referenced the needs of distant possessions. The presidency, already strengthened during the Civil War and Reconstruction, gained further prominence as foreign policy became more active. The ability to deploy forces quickly, negotiate agreements, and respond to crises enhanced executive authority, a trend that would continue in later conflicts. For individuals, the war and its aftermath opened new opportunities and challenges. Soldiers and sailors who had never traveled far from home found themselves in tropical climates, encountering unfamiliar foods, diseases, and landscapes. Some wrote letters and memoirs that conveyed a mix of wonder, boredom, fear, and excitement. Missionaries, teachers, and nurses followed, part of a broader American presence abroad that blurred the line between official policy and private initiative. Businessmen sought concessions, plantations, and contracts, tying local economies more closely to global markets. Yet empire also meant resistance. In the Philippines, even after major fighting subsided, nationalist sentiment did not vanish. Political leaders organized parties, newspapers, and civic groups to press for greater autonomy. In Cuba, intellectuals and activists debated the meaning of independence under the shadow of U.S. influence. Puerto Rican leaders argued over the island's status, with some favoring closer integration and others seeking more distinct self-government. These debates demonstrated that imperial relationships were not static. They were negotiated, contested, and reinterpreted over time. The moral arguments of the anti-imperialists, though they did not prevail in 1898, left a lasting imprint. Their insistence that power must be measured against principle resurfaced whenever the United States intervened abroad. They provided a vocabulary for critique, drawing on the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the nation's revolutionary heritage. Even those who supported an active foreign policy often felt compelled to frame actions in terms of eventual self-rule, consent, and development, a reflection of the enduring influence of Republican ideals. Internationally, other powers watched American actions with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. European empires recognized a new competitor, while some Asian leaders saw both threat and opportunity. Diplomatic recognition, alliances, and rivalries increasingly included the United States as a central player. The transformation from a continental republic to a global actor did not happen overnight, but the war with Spain was a clear marker of that transition. By the early 20th century, a generation had come of age for whom overseas territories, naval squadrons cruising distant waters, and American officials stationed abroad were normal features of national life. The debates of 1898 had not ended, but they had shifted from whether the United States should act like a great power to how it should do so. The legacy of the Spanish-American War lay not only in the specific places acquired or the battles fought, but in the habits of mind and institutions that took shape in its wake, shaping the nation's path through a century that would be defined again and again by the challenges and consequences of global power. The transformations set in motion at the end of the 19th century also altered how Americans imagined the very map of their nation. Before 1898, most citizens could draw the outline of the United States as a single, continuous landmass stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. After the war, that mental image no longer captured reality. Dots and archipelagos in the Caribbean and Pacific had to be added, places many Americans could not locate without a globe. Geography lessons changed. Newspapers printed maps showing sea lanes, coaling stations, and island chains, encouraging readers to think in oceanic rather than purely continental terms. This new spatial awareness reinforced the importance of naval power. Ships were not simply instruments of war, they were symbols of presence and mobility. The ability to move troops and supplies across oceans, to protect commerce, and to show the flag in distant ports became central to national strategy. The construction of the Panama Canal, begun under American direction after support for Panama's separation from Colombia, dramatically shortened the route between the Atlantic and Pacific, making the United States' far-flung holdings more defensible and more tightly connected. At the same time, the human dimension of empire complicated simple narratives of power. Americans who lived in or administered overseas territories often formed close relationships with local communities. Teachers in Philippine classrooms, doctors combating tropical diseases, and engineers building roads sometimes saw their work as a shared enterprise rather than domination. Filipino, Puerto Rican, and Cuban leaders, for their part, learned to navigate American political culture, traveling to Washington, lobbying Congress, and mastering the language of constitutional rights and self-determination. These interactions created hybrid political spaces, neither fully colonial nor fully independent. Still, the imbalance of power remained clear. Decisions made in Washington could override local preferences. Economic policies favored American investors in ways that shaped land ownership and labor patterns abroad. Military bases, such as the one established at Guantanamo Bay, represented enduring strategic footholds that outlasted particular crises. The promise that U.S. rule was temporary or exceptional was tested repeatedly against the realities of long-term presence. The Spanish-American War also influenced the United States' approach to later conflicts. The belief that a short, decisive war could achieve dramatic political results lingered in the national imagination. So did the assumption that American forces, motivated by ideals as well as interests, would be welcomed by populations suffering under other regimes. These expectations would be confirmed in some cases and confounded in others, but their roots can be traced back to the optimism and confidence generated in 1898. For Spain, the defeat marked the end of its status as a major colonial empire. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam forced a reckoning at home, prompting political and cultural soul-searching known as the Generation of '98. For Cubans, Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, and others, the war represented both an end and a beginning, the collapse of one imperial order and the emergence of another, with its own constraints and possibilities. In the United States, veterans' organizations and commemorations kept the memory of the conflict alive, but it was often remembered as a brief, almost romantic episode, overshadowed by the far larger wars that would follow in the 20th century. Yet its significance lies less in its duration than in its direction. It pointed the United States outward, across oceans, into a world where its decisions would affect millions beyond its borders. The tensions first laid bare during this period, between ideals and interests, liberation and control, consent and coercion, did not disappear. They became recurring themes in American political life, invoked by leaders seeking support and by critics demanding restraint. Each new generation revisited the questions posed in 1898, sometimes consciously, sometimes without recognizing the historical echo, to understand the birth of U.S. Imperialism is therefore to see not only a moment of conquest, but a moment of choice, when a nation defined by revolution against empire stepped onto the imperial stage. The choices made were shaped by fear, ambition, compassion, prejudice, and genuine belief in progress. Their consequences unfolded over decades, influencing international relations, domestic politics, and the lives of people from the Caribbean to Southeast Asia. The Spanish-American War stands as a gateway into that complex history, a short war that opened a long era. As the 20th century unfolded, the structures and assumptions forged in the aftermath of the war with Spain quietly shaped decisions that reached far beyond the original conflict. Policymakers who had cut their teeth on questions of Cuba and the Philippines carried those experiences into later crises. They had learned that public opinion could be mobilized through moral language, that rapid military victory did not guarantee political stability, and that governing other peoples required a mixture of force, negotiation, and administrative improvisation. The very vocabulary of foreign policy expanded. Terms like protectorate, mandate, intervention, and sphere of influence entered common usage. Americans grew accustomed to hearing about developments in places that had once seemed remote. Telegraph cables, steamships, and an increasingly global press made distant events feel immediate. The War of 1898 had coincided with these technological changes, reinforcing the sense that the United States was tied into a worldwide network of power and communication. Economic integration deepened these connections. Sugar from Cuba and Puerto Rico, hemp and other products from the Philippines, and trade flowing through Pacific routes linked American consumers and businesses to colonial economies. Tariff policies, shipping regulations, and investment decisions made in Washington had direct effects on farmers and workers thousands of miles away. This web of economic ties was often presented as mutually beneficial, but it also exposed colonial societies to the volatility of global markets and reinforced patterns of dependence. Education became one of the most visible arenas of American influence. In the Philippines, thousands of American teachers, known as Thomasites after the ship that carried many of them, arrived to establish a public school system. They taught English, American history, and civic ideals, believing they were preparing students for participation in modern self-government. Filipino students, for their part, absorbed these lessons in complex ways, sometimes embracing, sometimes adapting, sometimes resisting the perspectives offered. Education thus became both a tool of imperial policy and a resource for future nationalist movements. Public health campaigns similarly reflected both humanitarian concern and imperial logic. Efforts to combat yellow fever, malaria, and other diseases in Cuba and the Philippines saved lives and improved conditions for local populations. They also protected American troops and administrators, making overseas rule more sustainable. Advances in medical science and sanitation were celebrated as evidence of the benefits of American presence, yet they operated within a political framework in which ultimate authority rested elsewhere. The legal and political ambiguities of empire persisted. Residents of territories like Puerto Rico occupied a status that was neither fully foreign nor fully domestic. They could serve in the U.S. military and travel to the mainland, yet lacked voting representation in Congress and could not vote for the president. Debates over citizenship, rights, and identity became intertwined with questions of culture and language. These issues would resurface repeatedly, demonstrating that the legacy of 1898 was not confined to distant battlefields, but woven into the fabric of American constitutional life. Meanwhile, the symbolism of the Spanish-American War endured. It was often portrayed as a moment when the United States acted decisively and successfully on behalf of freedom. This narrative proved powerful, especially when contrasted with later, more ambiguous conflicts. Politicians and commentators invoked 1898 as an example of national unity and moral clarity, even as historians and critics pointed to the more complicated realities on the ground. For the peoples of the former Spanish colonies, the memory of the war and its aftermath fed their own national stories. In Cuba, the struggle against Spain and the subsequent limits on sovereignty shaped a political culture deeply sensitive to foreign influence. In the Philippines, the revolution against Spain and the war against the United States became foundational episodes in the long quest for full independence. These parallel memories remind us that the same events can carry very different meanings depending on perspective. Ultimately, the birth of U.S. imperialism at the turn of the century did not produce a single, fixed model of empire. Instead, it generated a set of practices and debates that evolved over time. Sometimes, the United States moved toward greater autonomy for its territories. At other times, it tightened control. Sometimes it justified actions in the name of stability, sometimes in the name of democracy, often in the language of both at once. The tension between principle and power, so evident in 1898, became a defining feature of the nation's global role. The Spanish-American War, brief and in some ways limited, thus occupies a disproportionate place in history. It marked the moment when the United States decisively stepped beyond its continental boundaries and accepted the responsibilities and burdens of overseas rule. It forced Americans to confront the gap between their ideals and their actions, a gap they would spend the next century trying to bridge, deny, or redefine as their influence reached into ever more corners of the world. Another lasting consequence of this turning point was psychological as much as political. The generation that experienced 1898 developed a heightened sense that history was accelerating and that the United States was destined to play a central role in shaping the new century. Newspapers, speeches, and popular books spoke of progress, modernity, and global competition. The closing of the Western frontier, announced by the census only a few years earlier, had created anxiety about where national energy would now be directed. Overseas expansion seemed to provide an answer, a new arena in which American industry, religion, and political ideals could operate. This outlook influenced not only foreign policy, but also domestic reform movements. Some progressives believed that the same spirit of efficiency and uplift applied at home could be extended abroad. Efforts to regulate corporations, improve urban sanitation, and expand public education paralleled campaigns to modernize colonial administrations. The belief in expert management and scientific solutions linked domestic and imperial governance, reinforcing the authority of trained administrators and reducing the role of local traditions in decision-making. At the same time, critics warned that the habits developed overseas, rule without full consent, reliance on military force, and racial hierarchies, could seep back into domestic life. They pointed to the treatment of labor unrest, the growth of federal power, and the persistence of segregation as signs that the line between foreign and domestic policy was more porous than many assumed. Empire, in this view, was not just something the United States did abroad, it was a condition that shaped political culture at home. The press, which had played such a dramatic role in the run-up to war, continued to shape perceptions. Correspondents sent vivid reports from Manila, Havana, and San Juan. Photographs, still a relatively new medium in mass journalism, brought images of soldiers, landscapes, and local populations to American readers. These representations could humanize distant peoples, but they could also exoticize or stereotype them, reinforcing simplified views that justified paternalistic policies. Literature and art absorbed these themes as well. Adventure stories set in tropical colonies, travel writing, and political satire all reflected the new global awareness. Some works celebrated American vigor and daring, others expressed unease or irony about imperial pretensions. Cultural production thus became another arena in which the meaning of 1898 was debated and reimagined. Within the military, the lessons of guerrilla warfare in the Philippines lingered. Officers studied counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence gathering, and civil-military relations. These experiences formed part of the institutional memory that would influence later campaigns. The recognition that conventional victory did not end conflict, and that political outcomes depended on winning local support as well as defeating armed opponents, was hard-learned and not easily applied. The story of the Spanish-American War also intersected with broader global trends. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the high tide of European imperialism, with powers carving up Africa and competing in Asia. The United States' entry into this arena both mirrored and diverged from European patterns. Like them, Americans spoke of civilization and progress. Unlike some, they often emphasized eventual self-government, though the timetable and sincerity of this promise varied. Observers abroad debated whether the United States represented a new, more benevolent form of empire or simply another variant of an old system. Over time, the territories acquired in 1898 followed different paths. Cuba's formal independence, constrained though it was, contrasted with the longer colonial relationship in the Philippines and the ongoing territorial status of Puerto Rico and Guam. These varied outcomes demonstrate that American imperialism was not a single uniform project, but a set of evolving relationships shaped by local conditions, international pressures, and domestic politics in the United States. What began as a war ostensibly fought to end Spanish misrule, thus became a catalyst for a redefinition of American identity. The United States did not cease to see itself as a champion of liberty, but it increasingly pursued that vision through mechanisms of power that resembled those of older empires. This dual self-image, as both liberator and ruler, created a persistent tension that would resurface whenever American forces crossed borders in the decades to come. By tracing the causes, conduct, and consequences of the conflict with Spain, we see more than a dramatic episode of naval battles and tropical campaigns. We see the moment when the United States stepped irreversibly into a world of global commitments, moral arguments, and political contradictions. The echoes of that decision continue to shape international relations and national debates, reminding us that even a short war can alter the trajectory of a nation for generations. In the decades that followed, the memory of 1898 functioned almost like a template, an origin story for an era in which the United States would increasingly measure its security and prosperity in global terms. Policymakers who came of age after the Spanish-American War inherited a set of assumptions that events in distant regions could have direct consequences for American interests, that the nation possessed both the capacity and the legitimacy to intervene, and that military victory could be paired with programs of political and social transformation. These assumptions were not always articulated openly, but they shaped choices in subtle and powerful ways. The interplay between public opinion and foreign policy, so visible during the crisis over Cuba, became a recurring feature of American life. Leaders learned that moral narratives could mobilize support, especially when framed around the protection of civilians, the defense of freedom, or the punishment of aggression. At the same time, they also learned that prolonged conflict, mounting casualties, or reports of abuses could erode that support. The Philippine-American War, with its reports of harsh tactics and civilian suffering, had already shown how quickly enthusiasm could turn to unease. Within the territories themselves, new political generations grew up under American rule. They attended schools that taught both local history and American civic ideals. They read newspapers that reported on debates in Washington as well as events at home. Some entered colonial administrations, serving as intermediaries between local communities and American officials. Others organized opposition movements, using the very language of rights and self-determination they had learned in American-style classrooms. The relationship between ruler and ruled was thus dynamic, marked by adaptation, negotiation, and resistance. Religious missions formed another layer of this interaction. Protestant and Catholic organizations expanded their activities in newly acquired territories, building churches, hospitals, and schools. Missionaries often saw themselves as agents of spiritual and moral improvement, but they also became part of the broader American presence, sometimes supporting colonial policies, sometimes criticizing them. Their work highlighted the blend of faith, philanthropy, and power that characterized much of the era's international engagement. The economic dimension of empire evolved as well. Large corporations invested in plantations, mines, and infrastructure projects, linking colonial production to American markets. This integration could bring jobs and development, but it also concentrated wealth and land in the hands of a few, reshaping local societies. Debates over labor rights, land reform, and economic sovereignty in places like Cuba and the Philippines were influenced by these patterns, and they often intersected with nationalist politics. Back in the United States, the idea of global responsibility became woven into political rhetoric. Presidents and legislators spoke of maintaining order, preventing instability, and ensuring open trade. Naval reviews, overseas tours, and international conferences reinforced the image of the United States as a major actor on the world stage. The nation that had once warned against foreign entanglements now found itself regularly engaged in them, justified by a mixture of strategic calculation and moral purpose. Yet beneath the confidence lay persistent questions. Could a republic exercise imperial power without undermining its own foundations? Could force be used to promote freedom without creating new forms of domination? These questions, first raised sharply during the debates over annexation and the Philippine War, never received final answers. Instead, they resurfaced in different forms whenever the United States intervened abroad, from the Caribbean to the Pacific and beyond. For historians, the Spanish-American War represents a hinge not only between centuries, but between political identities. It marked the moment when the United States ceased to be merely a former colony turned continental nation and became an overseas power with global reach. The choices made in 1898 were shaped by specific circumstances: Cuban rebellion, sensational journalism, strategic calculation, but their consequences extended far beyond those origins. They helped define the framework within which later generations would understand war, peace, and the nation's place in the world. As time passed, the direct participants in the war with Spain and the conflicts that followed began to fade from public life, but the institutions and precedents they had shaped endured. Military academies taught case studies drawn from Cuba and the Philippines. Diplomatic training emphasized the management of territories, protectorates, and complex regional politics. Legal scholars debated the meaning of sovereignty in an age when formal empire coexisted with informal influence, and when control could be exercised through financial leverage as well as through flags and garrisons. The story of 1898 also became intertwined with the United States' self-presentation abroad. American leaders often contrasted their actions with those of older empires, insisting that their goal was not exploitation, but uplift and eventual self-rule. This distinction was sometimes sincerely held, sometimes strategically emphasized, but it reflected a deep need to reconcile power with principle. The gap between rhetoric and reality, however, remained visible to those who lived under American authority, and it fueled skepticism about proclaimed intentions. Within the Caribbean basin, the pattern of intervention established after the Spanish-American War contributed to a cycle of dependence and resentment. Financial supervision, military occupations, and political mediation were justified as stabilizing measures, yet they also limited local autonomy. Nationalist leaders in the region studied the language of American constitutionalism and international law, using it to argue for greater respect and equality. Their appeals underscored the paradox of an empire that legitimized itself through ideals that could also be turned against it. In the Pacific, strategic calculations grew ever more complex. The rise of new powers in Asia, the importance of maritime trade routes, and the defense of island territories required sustained attention. Naval planning assumed that the United States must be prepared to operate far from its own shores, protecting lines of communication that stretched across vast distances. The logistical challenges first encountered in 1898, thus, became permanent features of military thinking. Culturally, the memory of the war contributed to a sense of national narrative in which the United States repeatedly stepped onto the world stage at moments of crisis. This narrative emphasized courage, decisiveness, and moral purpose. It often downplayed ambiguity and dissent, smoothing over the contested aspects of imperial expansion. Yet alternative memories persisted in scholarly works, political movements, and the stories passed down in Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, where the same events were remembered through different lenses. The legal framework established in the wake of 1898 continued to shape lives in tangible ways. Residents of unincorporated territories navigated a complex relationship with the United States, at once part of the nation and set apart from it. Questions of voting rights, federal benefits, and political status became recurring topics of debate. These issues illustrated how decisions made at the dawn of the imperial era had long afterlives, influencing generations who had no direct connection to the original war. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Spanish-American War lies in the habit of global engagement it fostered. Once the United States had assumed responsibilities overseas, withdrawal to a purely continental focus became difficult. Economic ties, strategic commitments, and political expectations created a web of connections that bound the nation to international affairs. Even when leaders sought to limit involvement, the structures built after 1898 exerted their own momentum. In this sense, the war marked not just the acquisition of territory, but the adoption of a role. The United States became a power whose decisions would reverberate far beyond its borders, whose ideals would be invoked both to justify action and to criticize it, and whose identity would be shaped by the ongoing effort to balance influence with restraint. The conflict with Spain was brief, but the era it inaugurated proved long, complex, and deeply consequential, setting the stage for the global history that followed. By the time the United States moved deeper into the 20th century, the choices made at the end of the 19th had blended so thoroughly into national life that many people no longer saw them as choices at all. Overseas bases, naval patrols, trade missions, and diplomatic interventions appeared as normal functions of a modern power. Yet if one looked closely, the roots of these practices traced back to the moment when the crisis in Cuba, the explosion in Havana Harbor, and the surge of public emotion had propelled the nation into a war that redefined its horizons. One of the most subtle but far-reaching changes was the expansion of the federal government's administrative capacity. Managing territories across oceans required bureaucracies capable of gathering information, drafting regulations, and supervising officials in distant posts. Communication technologies helped, but distance still posed challenges. The need to coordinate military, economic, and political strategies across regions encouraged a more centralized and professional state. This growth in capacity, first justified by imperial responsibilities, also strengthened the government's ability to address domestic issues. At the level of ideas, the experience of empire complicated the nation's traditional narrative of exceptionalism. Americans had long believed their country was different from European powers, less driven by conquest, more devoted to liberty. The events of 1898 forced a reconsideration. Some insisted that American expansion was unique because it aimed ultimately at freedom and self-government. Others argued that intentions mattered less than outcomes, and that the United States had entered the same moral gray zone as other empires. This debate over the meaning of American power became a permanent feature of political discourse. International law and diplomacy provided another arena in which the legacy of the war was felt. Questions about the treatment of civilians, the status of insurgents, and the rights of neutral powers arose during the Philippine conflict and influenced later discussions about the laws of war. The United States participated more actively in international conferences and negotiations, seeking to shape rules that would govern an increasingly interconnected world. Its experience as both a former colony and a new imperial power, gave it a distinctive, sometimes contradictory perspective. For the peoples of the former Spanish colonies, the transition to American rule or influence brought both continuity and change. Old elites sometimes adapted, finding ways to work within the new system, while others were displaced. New political movements emerged, drawing on local traditions and global ideas of nationalism. The process of state-building in these societies unfolded under the shadow of American presence, affecting constitutions, party systems, and civil-military relations. Even after formal independence was achieved, the imprint of this early period often remained visible. The memory of the Spanish-American War also influenced how Americans understood sacrifice and service. Though smaller in scale than later wars, it produced its own heroes, monuments, and rituals. Veterans groups advocated for pensions and recognition, contributing to the broader development of social policies for former soldiers. The idea that the nation owed something to those who fought abroad reinforced the connection between foreign ventures and domestic obligations. In education and public memory, the war became a gateway topic through which students first encountered the complexities of foreign policy. Textbooks presented maps of new territories, discussed debates over annexation, and introduced figures whose careers bridged domestic reform and overseas expansion. Over time, interpretations shifted, with some eras emphasizing glory and others highlighting controversy. This evolving memory reflected broader changes in how Americans assessed their role in the world. Ultimately, the birth of U.S. imperialism was not a single act but a process, beginning with the crisis over Cuba and extending through wars, treaties, and policies that reoriented the nation. The Spanish-American War served as the catalyst, the moment when latent forces, economic ambition, strategic thinking, moral rhetoric, and popular emotion converged. Its consequences radiated outward, shaping institutions, ideas, and relationships that would define the American century. Seen in long perspective, the events of 1898 formed a bridge between the age of continental conquest and the age of global strategy. During the 19th century, American expansion had largely meant the movement of settlers, the drawing of new state lines, and wars fought on or near the continent. After the Spanish-American War, expansion increasingly meant influence exerted through bases, treaties, financial systems, and political oversight rather than mass migration. Power traveled by ship, by cable, and later by air, reaching places where few Americans would ever permanently live. This shift changed how Americans thought about borders. The nation's security could no longer be defined solely by rivers, mountains, or coastlines. Instead, it depended on control of sea lanes, access to foreign ports, and the stability of governments far away. A rebellion in the Caribbean or unrest in Asia could now be framed as a matter of national concern. The distinction between foreign and domestic grew less clear as trade, migration, and communication tied regions together. The war also helped establish a pattern in which military success created political obligations. Once American forces had defeated Spain and occupied territories, simply walking away became complicated. There were questions about who would govern, how order would be maintained, and what would happen to local allies. These practical dilemmas often pushed policymakers toward deeper involvement than originally planned. The experience in the Philippines, where initial cooperation gave way to a protracted war, served as a powerful example of how intervention could evolve in unexpected ways. At the same time, the language used to describe American actions continued to emphasize ideals. Leaders spoke of preparing peoples for self-government, of bringing education and infrastructure, of acting in the interest of stability and progress. These goals were sometimes pursued with genuine commitment and produced real improvements in health, literacy, and public works. Yet they coexisted with structures of control that limited political freedom and prioritized American strategic needs. The coexistence of reform and domination became a defining feature of the imperial project. The legacy of the Spanish-American War thus lies not only in the specific territories acquired, but in the habits of governance it fostered. It normalized the idea that the United States might administer lands whose inhabitants did not enjoy full constitutional rights. It strengthened the executive branch in matters of foreign policy and military action. It linked economic expansion with political influence in new and durable ways. These patterns would reappear in different forms throughout the 20th century. For the societies drawn into the American orbit, the impact was equally lasting. Political institutions, educational systems, and economic structures developed in dialogue with American models and pressures. National identities were shaped in part through resistance to or adaptation of this relationship. The struggle to define sovereignty in a world of powerful states became a central theme of their histories. The Spanish-American War, brief in duration but vast in consequence, stands as the moment when the United States stepped fully into the role of an overseas power. It revealed the appeal of moral justifications for intervention, the limits of military solutions to political problems, and the enduring tension between a nation's ideals and its actions. From that point forward, the United States would move through the world with a new sense of possibility and responsibility, carrying with it the unresolved questions first posed at the dawn of its imperial age. As the narrative of American expansion continued to unfold, the Spanish-American War remained a reference point for both advocates and critics of an active global role. Those who supported intervention could point to 1898 as an example of decisive action that had toppled a declining empire and reshaped international alignments in a matter of months. Those who urged caution could point to the Philippine conflict that followed as evidence that victory in battle did not guarantee peace, and that the responsibilities assumed in war could stretch on far longer than anticipated. The institutional memory of these experiences filtered through generations of officers, diplomats, and civil servants. Manuals, lectures, and strategic plans drew lessons from the coordination of naval and land forces, the challenges of tropical logistics, and the complexities of working with local allies whose goals only partially overlapped with those of the United States. The realization that local political dynamics could not be easily controlled became a recurring theme, one that would resurface whenever American power encountered nationalist movements. Public discourse, too, carried echoes of 1898. When crises arose in other parts of the world, commentators reached back to the language of liberation and responsibility first popularized during the Cuban Rebellion. Images of suffering civilians, stories of oppression, and appeals to national honor remained potent tools for rallying support. At the same time, memories of controversial tactics and prolonged occupations served as warnings, reminding audiences that moral certainty could give way to moral ambiguity. The relationship between economic expansion and political influence, highlighted by the integration of Caribbean and Pacific economies into American trade networks, became a defining feature of modern international relations. Investments, loans, and commercial treaties often went hand in hand with diplomatic pressure and, at times, military presence. This blending of economic and strategic policy traced part of its lineage to the era when sugar, shipping routes, and coaling stations were central to debates about war with Spain. In cultural terms, the war contributed to a broader sense that the United States was part of a global story. Travel writing, world's fairs, and international exhibitions exposed Americans to cultures and technologies from around the globe, reinforcing the idea that their nation had a stake in worldwide developments. At the same time, stereotypes and simplified images of foreign peoples circulated widely, shaping popular understanding in ways that could both inspire curiosity and justify hierarchy. For historians, the Spanish-American War serves as a lens through which to examine the transformation of American power from regional to global. It illuminates how domestic politics, media, economic interests, and strategic theory can converge to produce momentous decisions. It shows how wars fought for declared ideals can lead to outcomes that challenge those very ideals. And it reminds us that the consequences of a conflict are not limited to the battlefield, but unfold over decades in institutions, laws, and collective memory. The birth of U.S. Imperialism was therefore not merely a change in foreign possessions, it was a shift in orientation, a redefinition of how the nation related to the wider world. The questions raised in 1898 about intervention, sovereignty, and the balance between principle and power have never entirely faded. They continue to surface whenever the United States confronts crises beyond its borders, carrying forward the legacy of a short war that opened a long and complicated chapter in the history of the Republic. By the early years of the new century, the generation that had debated intervention in Cuba found itself living in a country whose daily rhythms quietly reflected imperial reach. Coffee from the Caribbean, goods shipped through Pacific routes, and news from Asian capitals became part of ordinary life. The presence of territories and bases abroad meant that military planning, trade policy, and diplomatic negotiations routinely extended far beyond North America. What had once seemed extraordinary in 1898 now appeared embedded in the normal operations of the state. This normalization did not mean that the moral questions had been resolved. Instead, they became woven into the fabric of political argument. Supporters of a strong international role spoke of responsibility, stability, and leadership. They argued that in an interconnected world, withdrawal would invite chaos or domination by less benevolent powers. Critics countered that involvement often created the very instability it claimed to prevent, and that true fidelity to democratic principles required respect for the autonomy of other peoples. These competing visions drew on the same historical moment, interpreting its lessons in different ways. The Spanish-American War also helped shape expectations about the relationship between military action and national identity. Service overseas was portrayed as a test of character and a demonstration of national vitality. Monuments, veterans' reunions, and commemorations reinforced the idea that the nation's story included chapters written on distant shores. Yet alongside pride stood grief and disillusionment, especially among those who had witnessed the harsh realities of guerrilla warfare and occupation. In the territories themselves, American rule interacted with local traditions in complex ways. Legal codes, educational systems, and administrative practices introduced under U.S. authority blended with existing customs, producing hybrid institutions. Political leaders in these regions learned to operate in a space shaped by both local aspirations and imperial constraints. Over time, this experience contributed to the development of sophisticated nationalist movements capable of engaging with international law and global opinion. The broader world, too, absorbed the lesson that the United States had entered the ranks of powers capable of projecting force across oceans. Alliances, rivalries, and diplomatic calculations increasingly included Washington as a central factor. The balance of power in both the Atlantic and Pacific arenas had shifted, and other nations adjusted their strategies accordingly. The war with Spain thus played a part in the reconfiguration of global politics at the dawn of the 20th century. Looking back, it becomes clear that the conflict did not simply add territories to a map. It altered the trajectory of a nation. It expanded the scope of American action, deepened the entanglement between ideals and interests, and created institutional habits that would persist long after the original issues had faded. The debates it sparked over empire, democracy, and the uses of power remain relevant, echoing whenever the United States weighs whether and how to intervene beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War stands, therefore, as more than a brief military episode. It marks the birth of an American imperial presence that would shape the century to come, a presence defined by ambition, contradiction, reform, resistance, and the continual effort to reconcile a nation's self-image with the realities of its influence in the wider world. In tracing this transformation, it is important to remember how contingent the moment of 1898 truly was. The war did not arise from a single cause, but from a convergence of forces that might, under slightly different circumstances, have led elsewhere. Cuban revolutionaries fighting for independence, Spanish officials struggling to hold a crumbling empire together, American journalists chasing dramatic stories, naval strategists arguing for sea power, politicians responding to public outrage, and ordinary citizens moved by reports of suffering all played roles. The explosion in Havana harbor acted as a spark, but the tinder had been laid by years of economic ties, strategic thinking, and moral rhetoric. This complexity helps explain why the legacy of the war remains so debated. It can be seen as a humanitarian intervention, an act of opportunistic expansion, a defensive move in a competitive world, or some combination of all three. Each interpretation captures part of the truth. The war liberated Cuba from direct Spanish rule, yet it also ushered in a period of American dominance. It brought new infrastructure and institutions to the Philippines, yet it did so through a conflict that cost many lives and suppressed an existing independence movement. The same event thus carried both emancipatory and coercive dimensions. The story also illustrates the power of ideas in shaping policy. Concepts such as civilization, progress, and duty were not mere decorations on strategic decisions. They influenced how leaders and citizens understood their options. Many Americans genuinely believed they were acting in the interest of others as well as themselves. At the same time, these ideas could obscure the perspectives of those who did not share them, making it easier to dismiss resistance as ignorance or ingratitude rather than as a legitimate expression of self-determination. Over the long term, the Spanish-American War helped set the stage for a century in which the United States would repeatedly grapple with the responsibilities of power. The institutions strengthened in its aftermath, the Navy, the executive branch, the administrative state, became tools used in later crises. The precedents established for governing territories, intervening in neighboring regions, and framing actions in moral language provided templates that could be adapted to new circumstances. For the societies directly affected, the war became part of their foundational histories. In Cuba and the Philippines especially, the struggle against Spain and the subsequent relationship with the United States shaped national narratives about sovereignty, identity, and foreign influence. These memories influenced later political movements and diplomatic relations, demonstrating how the consequences of imperial encounters can echo across generations. Ultimately, the birth of U.S. imperialism at the turn of the century represents a moment when a republic defined by anti-colonial origins stepped into a role long occupied by the powers it had once resisted. The decision was not made in a single vote or battle, but through a series of actions, reactions, and justifications that unfolded over months and years. Its impact was to bind the United States more tightly to the wider world, ensuring that its history from that point forward would be inseparable from global currents of conflict, cooperation, and change. The Spanish-American War thus stands as a pivotal chapter in the ongoing story of how nations reconcile their ideals with the exercise of power, a story that continues to unfold wherever questions of intervention, sovereignty, and responsibility arise. What makes this episode especially significant is how quietly its assumptions settled into the background of American life. Later generations inherited a world in which the United States had long possessed overseas territories, maintained far-flung military facilities, and involved itself in the political affairs of other nations. The shock that accompanied these developments in 1898 faded, replaced by a sense that such engagement was simply how modern power operated. The novelty of empire gave way to routine, and routine has a way of disguising its own origins. Yet the contradictions never disappeared. The United States continued to speak the language of self-determination even as it managed territories whose residents lacked full political rights. It championed open markets and sovereign equality while using its weight to shape outcomes in weaker states. These tensions were not signs of simple hypocrisy so much as reflections of competing impulses within American political culture, a genuine attachment to ideals of liberty and a powerful drive to secure influence and advantage in a competitive world. The Spanish-American War was the moment when these impulses fused into a sustained global posture. Memory of the conflict evolved along with the nation. In some periods, it was recalled as a clean and righteous victory, a contrast to more prolonged and controversial wars. In others, it was re-examined as the starting point of entanglements that carried heavy moral and human costs. Historians uncovered neglected voices, Filipino revolutionaries, Cuban nationalists wary of American dominance, African-American soldiers navigating both patriotism and discrimination, complicating older heroic narratives. Each reinterpretation revealed as much about the era doing the remembering as about 1898 itself. The war's legacy also lies in the habits of thought it encouraged. It reinforced the belief that the United States could, and sometimes should, reshape political conditions beyond its borders. It suggested that military action could be paired with programs of reform, education, and institution building. It demonstrated that public opinion could be mobilized through appeals to morality and humanitarian concern. These ideas proved durable, resurfacing in varied forms across the decades that followed. At the same time, the limits exposed in the Philippines, where liberation from Spain turned into a bitter struggle against American rule, served as an enduring caution. They illustrated how local aspirations could diverge sharply from American expectations, how occupation could breed resistance, and how the line between benevolence and coercion could blur. These lessons, too, became part of the national experience, even when they were imperfectly remembered or applied. In the end, the Spanish-American War marked the threshold of an American century defined by global reach. It did not determine every subsequent event, but it established the framework within which those events would unfold. A republic born in rebellion against empire had become an imperial power itself, convinced that its expansion served both its own interests and a broader good. The effort to reconcile those two claims, to power and to principle, would shape American debates, policies, and identities long after the guns of 1898 had fallen silent. The deeper one looks into this turning point, the clearer it becomes that 1898 was not simply about territorial acquisition, but about a reorientation of national purpose. The United States had always told a story about itself, of liberty, opportunity, and self-government, but that story had largely been confined within continental space. With the Spanish-American War, the stage widened dramatically. Americans began to imagine that their institutions, values, and energy had relevance far beyond their own borders, and that history had placed them in a position to act. This sense of mission was not uniform or uncontested, yet it proved remarkably resilient. It shaped how leaders framed foreign crises, how educators taught history, and how ordinary citizens understood their country's place in the world. The belief that American involvement could bring order, development, or freedom to troubled regions drew strength from the memory of Cuba's liberation, even as critics pointed to the Philippines as a warning. Both examples became touchstones invoked to support opposing conclusions. Over time, the imperial framework constructed after the war became more subtle. Formal colonies gave way in some cases to informal influence exercised through diplomacy, economic leverage, and military partnerships. But the underlying assumption that the United States had both the capacity and a certain responsibility to shape events beyond its shores remained. The habits of intervention, institution building, and moral justification first systematized in this era continued to influence policy long after the original territories had moved toward different statuses. For the peoples whose lands were drawn into this system, the legacy was equally complex. They navigated the opportunities and constraints of American rule, appropriating some institutions, resisting others, and crafting national identities in dialogue with imperial power. Their experiences remind us that imperialism is never a one-way process. It is an interaction that transforms both sides. The United States was changed by its empire just as surely as Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam were changed by American presence. The Spanish-American War thus stands as a hinge between two versions of the United States, one primarily a continental republic, the other an overseas power with global interests and commitments. It did not erase earlier traditions, but it layered new responsibilities and contradictions onto them. The nation that emerged carried forward its founding ideals while operating in ways that often tested those ideals, a tension that would become one of the defining features of modern American history. By following the causes, campaigns, and consequences of this conflict, we see how a short war helped set the direction of a century, the birth of U.S. Imperialism was not an isolated episode, but the beginning of an ongoing story about power, principle, and the challenges of acting in a world where the fate of distant peoples and the decisions of a single nation could become tightly entwined. And so, as the echoes of 1898 carried forward, the Spanish-American War came to represent more than a clash between two nations. It symbolized the moment the United States crossed a psychological frontier. The earlier frontier, the one that had moved steadily westward across the continent, had offered land, resources, and a sense of destiny tied to settlement. The new frontier lay across oceans, defined not by homesteads, but by influence, bases, and political relationships. The tools of expansion shifted from wagon trains to warships, from land surveys to diplomatic notes and commercial treaties. This transformation altered how Americans understood power itself. Power was no longer only the ability to occupy territory with settlers and incorporate it as states. It was also the ability to shape conditions in places that would never become states, to guide political transitions, to intervene in crises, and to integrate distant economies into American trade networks. The language used to justify these actions, order, stability, development, freedom, echoed domestic reform movements, reinforcing the sense that the same progressive energy could be applied abroad. Yet beneath this confidence lay an enduring uncertainty. The United States had entered the imperial arena late compared to European powers, and it did so while still proclaiming anti-colonial origins. This dual identity produced a persistent tension. Americans could view themselves as reluctant or exceptional imperialists, convinced that their rule differed in kind, not just degree. Others, at home and abroad, saw patterns of domination that looked familiar, regardless of the rhetoric. The debate over which view was more accurate became part of the nation's ongoing self-examination. The Spanish-American War also revealed the growing influence of mass politics. Public opinion, stirred by newspapers and public speeches, played a decisive role in pushing leaders toward war. This dynamic would continue as citizens demanded a voice in foreign affairs and reacted strongly to reports from abroad. Democratic accountability thus became intertwined with imperial policy, sometimes encouraging restraint, at other times fueling intervention. For the soldiers who fought, the experience left lasting impressions. They encountered climates, cultures, and combat conditions unlike those at home. Disease claimed more lives than enemy fire in some campaigns, underscoring the limits of military power in unfamiliar environments. Their letters and memoirs captured both pride and disillusionment, contributing to a more complex public understanding of what overseas war entailed. The institutional legacy was equally significant. Systems for administering territories, coordinating military branches, and managing international negotiations grew more sophisticated. The federal government's reach expanded, and the presidency emerged as a central actor in shaping foreign policy. These developments, rooted in the necessities of empire, had ripple effects across the political system. In the broader sweep of history, the Spanish-American War marks the point at which the United States definitively joined the ranks of powers whose actions had global consequences. The nation did not abandon its ideals, but it now pursued them in a world where influence often required coercion, and where the line between assistance and control could blur. The birth of U.S. imperialism was thus both an assertion of confidence and the beginning of a long confrontation with the moral and practical dilemmas of power. The war's significance also lies in how it altered expectations about time and distance. In earlier eras, oceans had acted as vast buffers, insulating the United States from many of the rivalries and conflicts of Europe and Asia. By the end of the 19th century, steamships, undersea cables, and modern navies had compressed those distances. Events in Havana or Manila could become matters of urgent national concern within days. The Spanish-American War demonstrated that the United States could project force quickly across these spaces, reinforcing the idea that geography no longer guaranteed separation. This shrinking of distance encouraged a more continuous engagement with global affairs. Diplomats, merchants, missionaries, and soldiers formed networks that linked American cities to Caribbean ports and Asian capitals. Information flowed more rapidly, shaping public opinion and political debate. The nation's sense of itself expanded as Americans began to think of their country as part of a worldwide system rather than an isolated experiment in self-government. At the same time, the responsibilities assumed in 1898 complicated the meaning of independence for others. When the United States pledged to help Cuba achieve freedom, it did so within a framework that reserved significant influence for itself. When it spoke of preparing the Philippines for self-rule, it did so while suppressing an existing independence movement. These cases illustrate a broader pattern in which the language of liberation was intertwined with structures of supervision and control. The tension between promise and practice became a defining feature of the imperial relationship. The Spanish-American War also contributed to the professionalization of foreign policy. Expertise in languages, regional histories, and international law became more valued. Government departments expanded their overseas staffs. The management of empire required knowledge as well as force, and this need helped create a more specialized diplomatic and administrative class. Such developments strengthened the capacity of the state to act abroad, but they also raised questions about democratic oversight of complex international commitments. For the American public, the war and its aftermath fostered a sense that national destiny was bound up with global currents. Economic downturns, revolutions, or conflicts in distant regions could now affect American prosperity and security. This awareness encouraged both engagement and anxiety. Some embraced the role of world power as a sign of maturity and opportunity. Others worried that constant involvement would drain resources and compromise principles. In historical perspective, the birth of U.S. imperialism appears as a moment when older and newer visions of the nation intersected. The heritage of revolution against empire coexisted with a new willingness to wield imperial tools. The belief in self-government existed alongside practices that limited it for others. The confidence of a rising industrial power met the uncertainties of governing diverse societies. The Spanish-American War did not resolve these tensions. It brought them into the open, where they would shape debates and decisions for generations. Through this lens, the conflict stands not as an isolated episode, but as the opening act in a longer drama about how a republic adapts to global power. The choices made in 1898 set patterns, created institutions, and framed arguments that continued to influence the United States as it navigated the challenges of the 20th century and beyond. As the 20th century moved forward, the structures born in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War proved adaptable, shaping American responses to new and unforeseen challenges. The network of bases and coaling stations, first justified as necessities of naval strategy, evolved into a global web of military presence. The administrative practices developed in colonial governance informed later efforts at nation-building and international administration. Even the debates over constitutional rights in the territories echoed in discussions about the reach of American law in other contexts. The war's legacy also lived on in the language of obligation. Having assumed responsibility for distant populations at the turn of the century, American leaders grew accustomed to describing foreign policy in terms of duties as well as interests. Stability in neighboring regions, protection of trade routes, and the promotion of certain political values were framed as tasks the United States was uniquely positioned to undertake. This sense of obligation could inspire constructive engagement, but it could also lead to overextension as commitments multiplied. For citizens in the territories, the long relationship with the United States produced layered identities. Many served in the American Armed Forces, participated in economic exchange, and engaged with American culture, while also maintaining distinct national traditions and political aspirations. Their experiences challenge simple categories of colony and metropole, revealing instead a spectrum of connections that evolved over time. The Spanish-American War also shaped how Americans understood the risks of intervention. The ease of victory over Spain created expectations of quick success that later conflicts would complicate. At the same time, the drawn-out struggle in the Philippines provided an early example of the difficulties of counterinsurgency and occupation. These contrasting memories, swift triumph and protracted resistance, formed part of the collective memory, influencing how later generations anticipated and interpreted military ventures abroad. In the realm of international norms, the United States' emergence as an imperial power contributed to broader conversations about sovereignty, trusteeship, and the rights of subject peoples. The idea that powerful states might guide less developed regions towards self-government, controversial as it was, became part of global discourse. American experience in the Philippines and the Caribbean fed into these debates, demonstrating both the possibilities and the pitfalls of such claims. Looking back, the Spanish-American War can be seen as the moment when the United States accepted that its future would be intertwined with the fate of distant regions. It stepped into a world of alliances, rivalries, and responsibilities that could not easily be set aside. The ideals that had animated the nation since its founding did not vanish, but they were now tested on a global stage, where actions carried consequences for millions beyond American shores. The birth of U.S. imperialism was thus not a simple story of conquest or benevolence, but a complex transformation that reshaped institutions, ideas, and relationships. The conflict with Spain opened a path that the nation would follow, sometimes confidently, sometimes uneasily, as it navigated the challenges of power in an interconnected world. What ultimately makes the Spanish-American War so pivotal is not simply that it expanded American territory, but that it expanded the scale at which Americans believed history expected them to act. Before 1898, the United States could still imagine that its experiment in Republican government unfolded somewhat apart from the great power rivalries that shaped other continents. Afterward, that separation became harder to sustain. Whether Americans welcomed it or resisted it, their nation had entered a system where influence, intervention, and international responsibility were constant realities. The conflict also redefined what victory meant. Defeating Spain's fleet and armies was only the beginning. The far more complicated task was governing, reforming, and justifying a new order. This distinction between battlefield success and political settlement became one of the enduring lessons of the imperial age. In Cuba, the promise of liberation led to a constrained independence shaped by American oversight. In the Philippines, the fall of Spanish authority opened the door not to immediate freedom, but to another war. These outcomes revealed that the end of one empire did not automatically produce self-rule, and that power vacuums were quickly filled. At the level of national identity, Americans increasingly saw themselves as participants in a global drama. Their newspapers reported not just domestic affairs, but developments across oceans. Their leaders spoke of balance, stability, and international order. The language of destiny, once tied to continental expansion, was recast in global terms. Yet this outward turn never fully displaced inward concerns. Debates over race, citizenship, labor, and democracy at home were mirrored in arguments about the treatment of colonial subjects abroad. Empire acted like a mirror, reflecting domestic contradictions onto a wider stage. For those who opposed imperial expansion, 1898 remained a warning. They argued that the Republic risked losing its moral compass when it ruled people without their consent. Their voices did not prevent expansion, but they ensured that American imperialism would always be accompanied by self-criticism. That tradition of dissent became part of the nation's political culture, resurfacing whenever foreign interventions raised questions about purpose and legitimacy. Supporters, meanwhile, pointed to infrastructure built, schools opened, diseases reduced, and institutions established in overseas territories. They framed these as evidence that American involvement could produce tangible benefits. The debate between these interpretations, empire as exploitation versus empire as uplift, never reached a final verdict because the historical record contained elements of both. The Spanish-American War thus inaugurated not just an era of overseas power, but an era of argument about what that power meant. As decades passed, the specific memory of the war sometimes faded behind larger global conflicts, yet its structural legacy endured. The United States remained a nation with global military reach, economic networks that spanned oceans, and a political tradition that linked action abroad with moral purpose. The dilemmas first encountered in Cuba and the Philippines, how to intervene, how to withdraw, how to balance ideals with interests, became recurring features of modern history. In this sense, the Spanish-American War stands as a doorway. On one side lies the older republic, expanding across a continent but still able to imagine itself apart from empire. On the other side lies a global power, enmeshed in distant regions, compelled to make choices that affect the lives of people far beyond its borders. Crossing that threshold did not transform the United States overnight, but it set a direction from which there was no easy return. And once that threshold had been crossed, the central question was no longer whether the United States would play a role in world affairs, but what kind of role it would choose to play. The Spanish-American War had shown that public emotion, moral language, and strategic calculation could combine to propel the nation into decisive action. It had also shown that the aftermath of such action could be far more complicated than the moment of intervention. This dual lesson, confidence in the ability to act, uncertainty about the consequences, became a defining feature of the American approach to global power. Over time, the structures of empire evolved, but they did not simply vanish. Some territories moved toward greater autonomy, others remained linked in different ways, and still others became symbols of unresolved status. The debates over their futures highlighted a broader issue: how a nation founded on the consent of the governed could justify governing those who had not freely chosen that arrangement. Every policy discussion about territorial status, citizenship, and rights carried echoes of the original arguments from 1898. The war also left an imprint on the American understanding of modern warfare. It was among the first conflicts in which industrial technology, mass media, and global logistics converged. Rapid communication helped shape public opinion in real time. Steam-powered fleets enabled swift projection of force. Disease control and medical science became strategic concerns. These elements foreshadowed the character of later wars, in which information, industry, and public sentiment would be as important as battlefield tactics. Perhaps most importantly, the Spanish-American War altered the scale of American moral imagination. The suffering of civilians in Cuba had stirred public outrage and helped justify intervention. This responsiveness to distant humanitarian crises became part of the nation's self-image. Yet the same war revealed how easily the line between helping and ruling could blur. The desire to alleviate suffering could coexist with a reluctance to relinquish control. That tension would reappear whenever Americans confronted crises beyond their borders. For the peoples directly involved, the legacy was deeply personal as well as political. Families in Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam lived through upheaval, war, reform, and adaptation. Their histories became intertwined with that of the United States, creating bonds of migration, military service, and cultural exchange that endure. These human connections remind us that imperial history is not only about policies and strategies, but about lives reshaped by distant decisions. In the long arc of history, the Spanish-American War marks the moment when the United States stepped fully into the responsibilities and contradictions of global power. It did not abandon its ideals, but it began to pursue them in a world where influence often required force and where good intentions did not guarantee just outcomes. The birth of U.S. imperialism was thus both an expression of national confidence and the beginning of a prolonged reckoning with the costs and limits of power. As the century progressed, the patterns established in the wake of the Spanish-American War helped define how Americans interpreted later turning points. When new conflicts arose, leaders and citizens alike searched the past for guidance, and 1898 offered both inspiration and caution. It suggested that decisive action could reshape political landscapes, yet it also warned that the aftermath of intervention might prove unpredictable and morally fraught. These twin memories, of swift victory and of prolonged entanglement, formed part of the nation's strategic and emotional inheritance. The war also contributed to the evolution of the idea that national security extended beyond territorial defense. Protecting the homeland increasingly meant managing conditions abroad, ensuring open trade routes, preventing hostile powers from gaining footholds in strategic regions, and maintaining influence in neighboring areas. This broader conception of security had roots in the debates over Cuba and the Philippines, where instability was portrayed as a threat not only to local populations, but to American interests. Over time, this logic would justify a wide range of actions, from diplomacy to military intervention. At the same time, the democratic character of the United States ensured that imperial policy could never be entirely insulated from public scrutiny. Elections, congressional debates, and a free press kept questions of foreign engagement in the public eye. The anti-imperialist arguments of the early 20th century established a tradition of principled dissent that later critics of foreign interventions would draw upon. Thus, the birth of U.S. imperialism also gave rise to a durable countercurrent, a reminder that power must answer to principle. Culturally, the encounter with overseas societies broadened American horizons. Foods, words, music, and ideas traveled along the same routes as soldiers and merchants. Migration flowed in multiple directions, linking island territories and the mainland in new ways. These exchanges complicated simple distinctions between center and periphery, showing that empire reshaped the metropole as well as the colonies. For historians, the enduring importance of the Spanish-American War lies in its role as a starting point for the modern American era. It marked the convergence of industrial strength, naval power, mass politics, and global ambition. It forced the nation to confront the responsibilities that came with its growing capabilities. It set precedents for governance, intervention, and debate that would echo through the decades. The conflict did not dictate a single path, but it opened possibilities and created commitments that narrowed the range of future choices. Once the United States had assumed a global presence, retreat to isolation became increasingly difficult. The nation's fate became intertwined with events far beyond its shores, and its ideals were tested in new and demanding contexts. In this way, the Spanish-American War stands as the birth moment of an imperial phase in American history, an era defined by expansion of influence, by the blending of moral purpose with strategic interest, and by an ongoing struggle to reconcile power with the principles on which the Republic was founded. The questions first sharpened in 1898 continue to resonate, reminding us that the legacy of that brief war extends far beyond its battles, into the very structure of the modern world the United States helped to shape. If we step back and look at the entire arc that began in 1898, we see that the Spanish-American War did something rare in history. It shifted a nation's trajectory without requiring a long or devastating conflict. In a matter of months, the United States moved from a power primarily concerned with its own continent to one whose political, military, and economic systems were oriented outward. The transformation was gradual in its effects, but sudden in its origin, like a ship that has altered course only slightly yet is now headed toward a very different horizon. That change in direction influenced how Americans thought about responsibility. Increasingly, leaders framed inaction as a choice with consequences, arguing that instability abroad could not simply be ignored. This mindset, rooted in the logic first applied to Cuba and the Caribbean, encouraged a belief that the United States had to remain engaged to prevent worse outcomes. It was a view that could justify restraint or intervention, but it rested on the same foundation, the assumption that American power mattered everywhere. At the same time, the moral vocabulary that accompanied the war became a permanent feature of public life. Appeals to freedom, order, and human welfare accompanied strategic arguments, blending principle and interest in ways that were often inseparable. Critics pointed out that such language could mask unequal relationships and coercive policies, while supporters insisted that ideals gave American power a different character from that of older empires. The debate itself became part of the nation's identity, reflecting an ongoing effort to align action with belief. The Spanish-American War also left a legacy of interconnected histories. The United States, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam did not simply pass through a brief moment of contact and then separate. Their political systems, economies, and societies continued to influence one another. Migration, military service, trade, and cultural exchange created ties that endured long after formal colonial arrangements changed. These relationships remind us that imperial encounters generate shared pasts, even when memories of those encounters differ. In the end, the birth of U.S. imperialism was less about domination alone than about entry into a world where power carried constant obligations and controversies. The war forced Americans to confront the realities of governing others, the limits of military solutions, and the difficulty of translating ideals into policy. It expanded the nation's reach and deepened its entanglements, ensuring that its future would be shaped not only by domestic choices, but by events and peoples far beyond its original borders. The Spanish-American War thus stands as a watershed, a moment when the United States stepped onto a global stage from which it would not easily withdraw. Its legacy lives on in institutions, in debates, and in the enduring tension between the desire to act for a perceived greater good and the recognition that power always carries costs. And in the generations that followed, that tension became one of the central themes of modern American history. The Spanish-American War had demonstrated that the United States possessed the industrial strength, naval reach, and political will to shape events far from its shores. But it had also revealed that influence over other societies came with moral, political, and human consequences that could not be neatly controlled. From that point forward, American power would operate in a space between aspiration and reality, between the belief that it could foster progress and the evidence that intervention often produced unintended outcomes. The war also reshaped the emotional geography of the nation. Places that had once been distant abstractions became sites of memory and connection. Veterans recalled jungles, tropical heat, and unfamiliar cities. Families traced stories of service or migration that linked them to islands and archipelagos across the globe. These personal ties complemented the political and economic bonds, embedding the imperial moment in the lived experience of ordinary people. Over time, the territories acquired in 1898 followed different historical paths, yet all bore marks of the encounter. Political institutions, legal systems, and educational structures developed in conversation with American models. Local leaders learned to engage with the language of constitutionalism and international law, using it to press their own claims. In this way, imperial rule unintentionally equipped subject peoples with tools to challenge that rule, illustrating again the complexity of power exercised in the name of progress. For the United States itself, the legacy of the Spanish-American War can be seen in the enduring expectation that the nation will respond to crises beyond its borders. Whether in matters of war, humanitarian disaster, or political upheaval, the question is often not simply whether to act, but how. The precedent that American involvement is both possible and, in some sense, expected traces back to the moment when events in Cuba and the Philippines were defined as American concerns. Yet alongside this expectation runs a countercurrent of skepticism, rooted in the same history. The memory of prolonged conflict, of cultural misunderstanding, and of the difficulty of achieving lasting political solutions tempers enthusiasm for intervention. Thus, the birth of U.S. imperialism also gave rise to a lasting ambivalence, a recognition that power is necessary yet problematic, that action can be both principled and self-interested. The Spanish-American War, brief though it was, opened this enduring chapter. It marked the transition from a republic focused primarily on its own expansion to a nation engaged in shaping the wider world. The decisions made in that moment did not dictate every future step, but they set the parameters within which those steps would be taken. From then on, American history would be inseparable from global history, its ideals and its actions tested on a stage far larger than the one on which the Republic had first been born. As historians look back on this pivotal era, they often note how the Spanish-American War compressed into a short span of time debates that would otherwise have unfolded more gradually. Questions about race, citizenship, constitutional rights, military power, economic expansion, and moral responsibility all converged in the late 1890s. The urgency of war forced decisions that revealed underlying assumptions about who was fit to govern, whose rights mattered, and how far American authority should extend. In this sense, the conflict acted as a catalyst, bringing latent issues to the surface. One of the most striking aspects of the moment was the confidence many Americans felt in their institutions. The rapid industrial growth of the late 19th century, the expansion of education, and the experience of continental nation-building had fostered a belief that the United States had discovered effective models of governance and development. Extending these models abroad seemed, to supporters, both logical and benevolent. Yet the encounter with different cultures and political traditions showed that institutions could not simply be transplanted without friction. Local conditions shaped outcomes in ways that often surprised American planners. The war also revealed the growing interdependence of military and civilian spheres. Journalists influenced public opinion and policy. Business interests advocated for access to markets and resources. Missionaries and reformers framed imperial rule as a moral project. Soldiers became agents not only of combat, but of administration and social change. This blending of roles foreshadowed the complex interactions that would characterize modern statecraft. For the territories affected, the experience of American rule became a defining chapter in national histories. It influenced language use, educational systems, legal frameworks, and patterns of migration. Even after political relationships changed, these legacies remained embedded in institutions and social practices. The shared history of empire thus continued to shape identities and international relationships long after the formal structures of control evolved. In the United States, the memory of 1898 contributed to a broader narrative of emergence onto the world stage. It was often portrayed as the moment when the nation proved its strength and assumed its place among global powers. This narrative could inspire pride, but it also carried the weight of expectation that the United States would continue to lead, to intervene, and to bear responsibilities beyond its borders. Such expectations influenced policy choices and public attitudes well into the future. Ultimately, the Spanish-American War stands as the starting point of a modern American condition, a nation powerful enough to affect the lives of people far away, yet continually wrestling with how to use that power in ways consistent with its professed ideals. The birth of U.S. Imperialism was not a final destination, but the beginning of an ongoing journey, one marked by achievements, contradictions, and the persistent effort to reconcile national ambition with universal principles. As the long shadow of 1898 stretches across the 20th century, we can see how the Spanish-American War helped establish a pattern in which American power was justified through a combination of security concerns and moral aspiration. The instability of Cuba had been portrayed as both a humanitarian crisis and a threat to regional order. The Philippines had been described as a responsibility that the United States was uniquely positioned to shoulder. These dual justifications, safety and uplift, became a recurring framework through which foreign policy was explained to the public. The war also underscored the importance of narrative in shaping national action. Images of suffering civilians, stories of oppression, and appeals to honor had mobilized public sentiment. Once engaged, the nation constructed stories about its own role, stories of liberation, progress, and duty. These narratives could inspire sacrifice and commitment, but they could also simplify complex realities, making it harder to recognize local perspectives that did not fit the script. For those living in the territories, American rule was experienced not as an abstract debate, but as daily reality. Laws changed, schools opened, taxes were collected, and military patrols moved through towns and countryside. Some welcomed new opportunities, others resisted restrictions, and many navigated a path in between. Their choices and actions shaped the course of imperial governance, reminding us that empire is not imposed on passive subjects, but negotiated, contested, and reshaped from below. Within the United States, the war's legacy influenced civic education and public memory. It entered textbooks as a moment of national emergence, often presented with a tone of confidence and purpose. Only later did more critical perspectives gain wider attention, highlighting the costs and contradictions of imperial expansion. This evolving memory reflects the nation's ongoing effort to come to terms with a past that is neither wholly triumphant nor wholly tragic. In the broader sweep of global history, the Spanish-American War marked the entry of a new actor into the ranks of world powers. It altered the balance in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and signaled that the United States would play a role in shaping international norms and institutions. The nation that had once focused on securing its own independence now found itself involved in debates about the independence and governance of others. The birth of U.S. imperialism thus represents a turning point not only for the United States, but for the international system of the modern era. It demonstrated how quickly a nation's scope of action could expand, and how deeply such expansion could affect both the powerful and the less powerful. The questions first confronted in 1898 about intervention, responsibility, and the meaning of freedom continue to echo, reminding us that the legacy of that brief war endures in the structures and arguments of the world we inhabit. In reflecting on this turning point, it becomes clear that the Spanish-American War was not simply a departure from earlier American traditions, but also an extension of them into a new arena. The belief in expansion, the confidence in national institutions, and the conviction that the United States had a distinctive role to play in advancing liberty had long been part of the national story. What changed in 1898 was the scale and setting. The same impulses that had driven continental growth were now projected across oceans, applied to societies with different histories and expectations. This extension brought new forms of visibility and scrutiny. Actions taken in Cuba or the Philippines were debated not only at home, but also abroad. Other nations assessed American behavior as they had long assessed European empires. The United States, which had once criticized imperial practices from the outside, now found itself judged by the same standards. Its conduct in war, its treatment of subject populations, and its adherence to international norms became matters of global attention. The war also deepened the connection between economic strength and political influence. Industrial production, financial resources, and technological innovation provided the means to sustain overseas commitments. In turn, access to new markets and resources fed back into economic growth. This reciprocal relationship between economic and strategic power became a defining feature of the American role in the world, linking domestic prosperity with international engagement. For individuals, the imperial moment expanded horizons in tangible ways. Travel, migration, and cultural exchange increased. Americans encountered new languages, religions, and social systems, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with misunderstanding. These encounters influenced art, literature, and popular culture, leaving traces in everyday life. The empire, in this sense, was not only a political structure, but also a field of human contact that reshaped perceptions on all sides. Yet the central tension remained unresolved. Could a nation committed to government by consent justify ruling those who had not consented? Could the promise of future self-rule balance the reality of present control? These questions, sharpened in the debates over annexation and the Philippine War, continued to surface whenever the United States exercised power beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War did not provide definitive answers. It ensured that the questions would persist. As we follow the thread from 1898 forward, we see a nation continually negotiating its identity as both a republic and an empire. The birth of U.S. Imperialism did not erase the country's founding ideals, but it placed them in tension with new responsibilities and ambitions. That tension between principle and power, liberation and control, became one of the defining dynamics of modern American history, shaping decisions, debates, and destinies far beyond the moment when war with Spain first began. In the final analysis, the Spanish-American War stands as a moment when the United States discovered that power, once acquired, reshapes the nation that wields it. The decision to intervene in Cuba and to retain former Spanish territories did not simply alter foreign maps. It changed the internal balance of institutions, expectations, and political culture. The presidency grew more central in foreign affairs, the military became a permanent instrument of global presence, and the language of national purpose expanded to encompass distant peoples and places. The conflict also revealed that empire is as much about imagination as administration. Americans had to picture themselves as actors in a global drama, responsible for outcomes far from home. They had to reconcile pride in national achievement with awareness of suffering caused by their own actions. This imaginative shift, seeing the world as a field of American concern, was one of the most lasting consequences of 1898. For the peoples drawn into the American orbit, the experience of empire produced its own transformations. They engaged with new political institutions, economic networks, and cultural influences, adapting them to local circumstances. Their resistance, cooperation, and negotiation shaped the contours of American rule and eventually the paths toward altered political status. Empire was thus a relationship, not a one-sided imposition, though the imbalance of power was always present. The Spanish-American War did not resolve the contradictions it exposed. Instead, it set the stage on which they would be acted out again and again. Each generation would revisit the questions first posed in that era. When should the United States intervene? In whose interest? With what limits? How can a nation dedicated to self-government exercise authority over others without undermining its own principles? These questions, born in the heat of a short war at the turn of the century, became permanent fixtures of American political life. In this way, the birth of U.S. imperialism marks not an end point, but a beginning. It signals the start of an era in which the United States would move through the world as a power whose reach and ideals extended far beyond its original borders, and whose history would be inseparable from the histories of many other nations. The legacy of 1898 lives on in institutions, in debates, and in the ongoing effort to balance influence with restraint, ambition with humility, and national interest with universal principle.